Antiquity Unveiled. The most marvelous revelations of the 19th century concerning the origin of Christianity by Jonathan M. Roberts. Euthalius, a Greek theologian. And okay, this one's slightly longer than the last program, but good evening, sir. My name was Euthalius of Alexandria. I lived in the 5th century and was a commentator on the Pauline epistles. I mean, you really believe that people be like, oh, well, good evening, Those epistles are those which were brought from India by Apollonius, obtained by the latter through the king Phraates of Taxila. The Gospel according to Matthew is not original, but is of Armenian origin. The Gospel according to St. Mark was left by Apollonius with the Thessalonians, according to the text of the epistle to them. The Gospel according to St. Luke is but a modified version of the legend of Prometheus bound, as rendered by Lucian and Marcion at Rome. And what was Milton's? Not Paradise Lost. There's something else by Milton, wasn't there? Or was it William Blake? The Gospel according to St. John was written by Apollonius of Tyana towards the latter part of his life, when he was an old man on the island of Patmos, where he retired to end his days in isolation from the human race. That Gospel is a blending with what the inspired seer hoped for, the knowledge which he feared to impart in such terms as uneducated mortals could understand, was also a factor. The Acts of the Apostles relate the doings of Apollonius and his disciples, and this was fully understood by the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists up to the time of Eusebius of Caesarea. Okay. Ammonius Saccas, Plotinus, and their followers were gymnosophists. Gnostics and Neoplatonists combined. They had no idea or intention of promulgating anything but what they regarded as truth, truer or better men than were Ammonius and Plotinus never lived. This is made plain to me by the study of their writings. Apollonius, Ammonius, and Plotinus were the purest and best of men. Their only desire was to elevate the human race. Their teachings had a relation to the Brahminical and Buddhistic canonical narratives concerning the Indian savior, Krishna. I now see an ethereal spirit of light which appears behind and over you. The words were addressed to the people at the seance, who says he is Krishna, of whom the story of his divine origin, persecuted by the tyrant Kansa, and miraculous performances were exaggerations, and that his sole work was that of a moral reformer, and his only object to make the people of his country happy. Well, content with what is right and their lot. For these services, Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, verse 60, I'm thinking. For these services he was worshipped and regarded as an incarnation of Brahma, or the spirit of the universe. Well, Vishnu, see, Just another feature that we know this person wasn't telling the truth. Lying spirit or lying medium, one of the two. He shows me that the figure of these three, repeated 4 times, of which I understand him to imply that he was born 3333 BCE in India at the foot of a mountain near Mathura on the Juna. We remarked we had always supposed Krishna to have been a myth. No, well, as a myth does not mean lie. In the Greek so-called New Testament, it does not mean lie. Now, fable, different story. No, he was a man, and the original of all the world's modern saviors. The canonical epistles, as far as I know anything about them, were all derived from the writings of Apollonius of Tyana, to whom is concealed the fact that has been called Paul, or Paulus. The names of James, Peter, John, and Jude were attached to the other epistles sent to communities too insignificant to be mentioned. All these teachings were appropriated either successfully or unsuccessfully by Eusebius of Caesarea to make good his theological Christian scheme. But he failing in his purpose to some extent, and I seeing that it was a grand opportunity for me to gain renown, acknowledge their authority, and set about them from his standpoint, I put these Indian writings of Apollonius into my own shape and eliminated from them every mention of Apollonius or Krishna, and substituted therefore Paul and the Christ idea. This work of Eusebius and myself became the better assured in proportion as the original writing and traces of them became destroyed. What I have told you is the truth. And actually, if you look into it, what is said about Apollonius and some of these other figures sounds a lot more honest and reliable than what Paul has said. So Paul could have been a real character who looked at what had been done, looked at what had been done before, and said, "Okay, I'll also send out letters to such and such." Small groups. A lot of these churches you hear in the New Testament are less than 10 people. So Paul had an influence. We can probably say that Paul is a historical figure, but we can say that Paul was grafted into other individuals, or that he looked at the example of what was done before him and said, I can do that. And well, he couldn't, but he did he took a chance at it and had some effect, and later on they grouped everybody else who did the same things into, let's only talk about Paul. Let's only talk about Jesus. Let's only talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that sort of thing. We refer to the count of Euthalius, to Nouvelle Biographie Générale. According to the spirit statement of Euthalius, it is both certain that the Gospels of Matthew and John were both the production of Apollonius of Tyana, the former written at an early period of his career, and closely in accordance with the gymnosophic theology or philosophy, and the latter near the close of his life, after he had matured his theological conceptions. There is no doubt that the theological and philosophical views of Apollonius underwent very material modifications as he advanced in his realization of the spiritual department of natural forces and causes, and hence the spiritual nature of the latter Gospels as compared with the crude and less spiritually developed characteristics of the first or original Gospel of his adoption. There is a singular analogy between the name of Apollonius and John. They are both designations of the light that lighteth all men coming into the world, the sun. The sun among the Greeks was designated Apollo and Ion. Ion, the Greek name of the sun, etymologically speaking. Much like is it the cream or is it the cream mantra that's kind of similar to the sun in meaning? electric energy, but bija mantras, every letter and syllable in Sanskrit is given a false god attributed to it, or maybe not a false god, maybe a name of God that is pictured like it's a different god. But I, the one, and on, the being, the one being. Eusebius and his successors, who have labored so hard to deprive Apollonius of the credit of his theological labors, has substituted Aeon, or John, for Apollonius. Ioannes in Greek. In view of all the facts, we are led to credit the spirit statement of Euthalius, and to accept his statement that Apollonius wrote the Gospel of St. John, as it is called, on the island of Patmos, where he also, under spirit control, wrote the Revelations. Well, I've seen the Eremia of the Book of Revelations as written by Barabbas, Judah ben Judah, a century before. Well, closer to a century before, 90 years before, 80-something years before, I think. The spirit of Euthalius tells us that the Acts of the Apostles relate the doings of Apollonius and his disciples, and that this was fully understood by the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists up to the time of Eusebius, 325 to 350 of the Common Era. This is undoubtedly the fact, since Saul of Tarsus, or St. Paul, was no other individual than Apollonius of Tyana himself. Ammonius, Saccas, Plotinus, and Porphyry, I think it's Porphyry, were undoubtedly Gnostic followers of Apollonius, and all were what Euthalius testifies as they were, as good and pure men as ever lived. It is almost certain that the divine incarnation, so-called, in Apollonius' system of philosophy and theology was Krishna of the Hindu theologies, called Christos in the Greek language, and known in the various other languages by still other titles, as well as will be found in other communications. The Spirit says that the canonical epistles, so far as he knew anything about them, were all derived from the writings of Apollonius of Tyana, and that to conceal the real authorship, Eusebius attributed them to Paul or Paulus, which was but a modification of Paul, the abbreviated name of Apollonius. Euthalius tells us that Eusebius did not perfectly succeed in robbing Apollonius of the credit of his life labors, that he, Euthalius, completed that work, in view of the facts that Euthalius is acknowledged to have broken the epistles, canonical and Catholic, and the Acts of Apostles into chapters and verses, in order to add to the contents of the chapters, as it is also admitted historically on the testimony of Euthalius himself, that he collected them with the copies in the library of Eusebius Pamphilus at Caesarea, and that can be no doubt he was fully acquainted with the alterations that had been made from the originals by Eusebius. Indeed, he tells us that the Indian writings of Apollonius were at that time in the Pamphilian library at Caesarea, and that he modified them to suit himself, and eliminated from them the names of Apollonius and Krishna, and substituted therefore Paul and the Christ idea. So, what happened in that generation? What happened in that generation? Oh! Could it be that the Catholic Church became a dominant force, or an officially recognized force, and then a dominant force in the Roman Empire? Well, there was a gap where some persecution came back around, but they were not done changing the Bible. They compiled the books. Some mentions, let's add Christ more. Let's say Christ more when we write out our Bible, and a few changes to Paul. But from a couple centuries before, you actually have virtually the same Pauline manuscripts that we have today. So right around before even some of the Gospels, the Pauline, of course the Pauline manuscripts exist from before that because they came first. Because the people who wrote the others weren't around yet, or they were too young.